Could Noah's flood have really happened?
What are some of the best arguments against the flood, and how do we refute them?
Today on Creation Magazine Live. Well, welcome to Creation Magazine Live, the television program that gives Christians answers similar to what you'll find in Creation Magazine.
That's right. And on today's program, we're going to talk about that pivotal event in the history of the universe, the global flood, Noah's flood.
Noah's flood is commonly known. And now we've covered Noah's flood quite a bit.
Yeah,
We've done
the ark and other things related to the flood,
right.
Certainly.
But this is such an important topic because what we're going to focus on in this episode is the arguments that skeptics have used to go against some of the arguments that we've put forth.
Right, to try to refute a global flood.
Right, and so there's some very specific arguments that have come against some of the creationist arguments, and we're going to go through them point by point, and of course we're going to have Dr. Emil Silvestru, who's got a PhD in geology, so
yes.
a good fellow to have, one of our staff here at the Canadian office.
Yes, it really is a pivotal event in Earth history, because if the flood happened, then it's the explanation for the layers of strata and the fossils that they contain.
Right.
But then, of course, the conclusion is that the fossils and the rocks are not evidence for millions of years.
Right.
Evidence for a global flood is actually evidence against evolution.
Right, because with no millions of years, you don't have millions of years to evolve anything, and then
they need millions of years.
Right.
I mean, evolution. Every evolutionist has to believe that the Earth and the universe is very, very old.
Right. Now, there's a prophecy in the New Testament that talks about this debate, actually.
Yes.
2 Peter 3:3-6. In the last days, scoffers will come. They deliberately forget that long ago by God's word the heavens existed and the earth was formed out of water and by water. By these waters also the world of that time was deluged and destroyed. So here we see a glimpse of a prophecy of a battle that's raging today, and we're going to get into that in just a few moments, so stay tuned.
There are many physical evidences on Earth to contradict the billions of years that evolution teaches, like the red blood cells and hemoglobin that have been found in an unfossilized dinosaur bone. Evolutionists believe that dinosaurs died 65 million years ago, but discoveries like this one contradict that belief. The Bible says that land animals, which would have included dinosaurs, were made on day 6 of the creation week. There is no contradiction between what the Bible says and evidence that dinosaurs lived recently.
Well, today we're going to talk about some arguments that skeptics have posed against creationist arguments for Noah's flood. And interesting that a lot of times when I'm out speaking, I will meet Christians that will give arguments against Noah's flood too, but that perhaps it wasn't a global flood, that it was a local flood and things like that. And of course we've emphasized why we believe that Christians should accept it as a real event. And just want to throw this verse up and remind people that Jesus himself believed in a global catastrophic flood.
Yes.
Here's Matthew 24. For as were the days of Noah, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. For as in those days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day when Noah entered the ark, and they were unaware until the flood came and swept them all away. So will be the coming of the Son of Man. And I remember one famous skeptic actually saying, but did Jesus actually believe in a flood, a coming flood, like the coming judgment was to come? What value does his warning of a coming judgment have if the judgment he was referring to wasn't an actual real event?
Wasn't global, didn't include everyone.
Right. So,
Thomas Huxley, wasn't it?
Yes, it was.
Yeah.
So, let's...
what are some of those questions? I mean, we get a lot of the questions from Christians, I think, are just honest They're just wondering, how did the flood work?
How did it work?
Like, what are some of these things? So some of the questions we get, and from skeptics as well, is there's not enough water, right? There's not enough water. You can't flood the whole Earth. You got Mount Everest, and you got all these mountains. Impossible. Not enough water to get the job done.
Right.
So what's the answer there?
Well, first, let me just lay it out very simply. There's a logical argument for a global flood and Christianity. If there wasn't a global flood, then why build an ark? Animals could have migrated, Noah could have moved away, birds could have flown away.
Sure.
Right.
There you go.
Yeah.
And then if that was a local flood, since we had so many ever since, and millions of people died, it means God has not kept his promise. Because
he
he
said-
promised that he will never destroy the world with another
Right.
flood.
In that
so Noah's
fashion,
flood
yes.
has to be global.
Yep.
Now, where does the water come from, and where it actually went after the flood?
Yes.
Let's just switch on a totally different mind frame. Look into the oceans. 2/3 of this planet, water. Look at the volume down there. It's a huge hollow with mountains down there and all that. It's a bigger relief, landscape, if you wish, in the bottom of the ocean than there is on the continent.
Right.
So what happens if you somehow modify the volume of the ocean? You diminish it a bit. Why does the depth of the ocean always have to be the same? Just think about it.
Right.
Forget all other arguments. There's enough water in the oceans, said Commander Cousteau, to cover the land with 3 kilometers if you level the high mountain ranges and the deep ocean trenches like the Mariana Trench.
If make everything even.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, think about it. What does cause high mountains and deep ocean trenches? Plate tectonics.
Plate tectonics, yeah.
Is where continents collide, that is, they scrape the sediments from the bottom of the ocean and push them up.
Yeah, we've
Like the
talked about this on a previous program.
Yeah. So the yellow band on Mount Everest, 8,500 meters of elevation, containing fossil fish and stuff like that. And then the ocean trenches is where the plates are subducted, dragged down.
Yeah.
So now, all you have to do is to keep in mind that plate tectonics did not exist from the very beginning. There was a moment of start, and you spoke about this in Dr. John Baumgartner's model of catastrophic plate tectonics.
Yes.
But the result of it, as it started, it first of all reshaped the ocean. So the ocean's depth was minimized or diminished with a vertical mile, roughly, because of the formation of a new floor. The pre-flood floor was consumed inside the Earth's mantle and replaced by a new one. And in the process, the continents drifted away.
Okay, so this new ocean floor that's being produced then as a result of plate tectonics during
Yes.
the flood, the new ocean floor is a mile higher
Yes.
than the old ocean floor that's being pulled into the Earth.
What's going to happen to the waters? They will run over the
Yeah,
continents.
out of the continents, yeah.
Now another argument those skeptics are using is they're saying, okay, so you've got all the water, but then you've got to deal with the sediments. There's so much sediment that you have to account for that if that happened, if the majority happened during Noah's flood, wouldn't there just be some huge, Noah's mud bath rather than Noah's flood?
Yeah, well, here it is. We have to deal here with a very, very important thing. Before we even deal with the subject itself, how does one estimate the volume of sediments?
Okay.
Nobody has ever done a research accurate enough to come up with an accurate volume.
Okay, so it's
So
just an estimate.
It's just a wild estimate which could be wrong by orders of magnitude. But
Oh,
the
really?
point, oh sure, but the point is sediments have not settled down. They have been eroded. Rocks have been eroded from the continents and dumped, transported into the ocean. So you didn't have to have this mixed up.
Let's follow up in the next segment here.
In 1853, archaeologists found a series of 12 tablets dated to around 650 BC, the story of the hero Gilgamesh. The Gilgamesh epic has close parallels to the account of Noah's flood and has led some skeptics to imply that the biblical account is a retelling of the Babylonian legend. However, there are major differences which give clues as to which account is more accurate. In the Gilgamesh epic, the ark is a cube, a terrible design for rough waters. Noah's ark was built to be tremendously stable. The Genesis account came first. The Gilgamesh epic is a distortion. When sequences of DNA which did not appear to code for protein were discovered, some evolutionists suggested that these represented junk or vestigial DNA, leftovers of our supposed evolutionary ancestry. However, researchers the world over are confirming that non-coding DNA holds critical clues to a vast range of diseases. A leading figure in genetics, Professor John Mattox said, "The failure to recognize the implications of the non-coding DNA will go down as the biggest mistake in the history of molecular biology." For details, go to www.creation.com.
All right, so we can explain where the water came from. It's still here. We have a vertical adjustment between the continents and the ocean bottoms. The mountain chains like the Himalayas were created toward the end of the flood, and then pushed up above the water.
Deep oceans.
And the deep ocean
went
trenches.
down
So we have the water running off the continents after the flood. Then we have sedimentation, how those sediments could have been laid down in the flood. And another objection is varves, an extremely fine layering. This objection is that those things can only be produced in a stagnant pond, in a lake or something.
Yes, and in addition to that, there's light and dark bands, and they consider to be seasonal, so a couple of those would make a year.
Right.
So you can count the years by the couples of dark and light. Well, first of all, this idea that sedimentation occurs, like say in a big tank, you mix sediments coarse, medium, fine, and the coarse ones would be the first one to fall to the bottom because they're heavier, then you have the medium on top of them, and then the finest on top. That is based on lab experiments, but question is, who is going to stir up the whole ocean with the sediments like that and then wait for them to be laid down?
Okay, look.
There you go, you see? So actually it turns out, experiments show that if you move water mixed with sediments, fine, medium, and coarse, very fast, what results is layer upon layer upon layer upon layer, nicely, smoothly bound of sediments.
So water has a tremendous ability to sort things by size, by shape, and by buoyancy.
By all means.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of geometry issues in there and the way that the particles would roll. But what you have, the water moves this way, but it creates layers, horizontal layers. And recent experiments have shown that that includes very fine sediments, like mud and silt. But you know what? This is an experience that we all have seen.
Yes.
You know, on the roadside, you know, after big rain, you see the water moving fast, and lo and behold, once the water is gone, you see the fine silt deposited from moving water. So you don't need a stagnant body of water to lay down the sediments.
Okay, so experimentation pretty much rules that question out.
By all means. Right. But you have to do the right experiment.
Right, sure.
Okay, well, another objection that people have said is that, you know, we've got granites and that they can only be produced in a certain way. You need millions of years to cool them down, so therefore the Earth must be millions of years old because we've got granites all over the world.
Well, the idea is that if you have such big crystals in the granites, they have to take a long time to cool down and keep growing until they get to that size. Well, that's not necessarily the case, because first of all, you need to keep in mind that these granites have been cooling in a very humid environment, wet sediments into which they were actually placed. So the water would take a lot of that heat away, so the cooling is going to happen faster. Even because the solutions are there, the crystals will still grow big. And then there are other very interesting aspects. I've seen hundreds of contacts between granite and some other rocks. Now, if the other rock was there and the granite was placed into it, and it had millions of years to cool, how come that there's nothing? It's a smooth transition from one to the next. Well, if this thing cools over millions of years, the other rocks should be somehow different, eroded, affected, but not in this case. It's a smooth boundary, like all of them have been formed at the same time.
Okay.
And that's the best way to explain it. You have this sediments laid down, still water-laden and not compacted, like not hard rocks, still soft rocks. And then you have the granites intruded into them, and they cool because of that water, and the sediments turn into hard rocks, and then you have that nice and smooth boundary. And all happens in a short time because you have enough water to act as a conveyor belt to take away the heat and favor the crystallization. And the other aspect is that hydrothermal solutions, hot solutions circulating around igneous bodies like this, bodies of lava or magma, they take a lot of minerals from the surrounding rocks, including the igneous rocks, and they carry them dissolved in the solution. And solutions can lay down like mother loads of minerals, like metals and all that, or just crystals. But solutions play a very important role, and it turns out that's not just in this particular narrow environment, but virtually everywhere in all kinds of geological environments. Hydrothermal solutions, once again, hot mineral solutions, play a very important role in a way that minerals are laid down, in a way that rocks are actually created. Because if you want to create a sedimentary rock out of a broken up rock, we call this a terrigenous rock, you have to bind together the little grains.
Right.
Well, where do you get the cement from? It's a huge amount of cement to bind the grains together. Well, there you go. This solution's coming from during the flood, are the ones that have penetrated all the sedimentary environments and bound the sediments together and cooled the granites.
The central teaching of Christianity is directly connected to Genesis. With the first man, Adam, came the first sin, seen in Genesis as violation of the law of God. The Bible teaches that God forgives sin, but only by a substitutionary sacrifice. God has provided salvation through His Son, the last Adam, Jesus Christ. The prophet Isaiah refers to Jesus as the kinsman redeemer, that is, one who is related by blood to those he redeems. All of us, including Jesus, are descendants of the first Adam. An historical first and last Adam are essential to the gospel message.
Stones and Bones by author Carl Wieland. This popular 48-page booklet offers basic reasons for rejecting evolution in favor of creation. Easy to understand explanations on fossils, missing links, mutations, dinosaurs, natural selection, and more provide a high-impact apologetic book in a small package. As PhD scientist in immunology and molecular biology Miles Cooper stated after reading it, this little book overthrew 40 years of evolutionary indoctrination for me.
All right, another objection to a global flood is you've got metamorphic rock. Remember three types of rock. You've got sedimentary, metamorphic, and igneous, and you've got metamorphic rock, and on top of that there's many very thick layers of sedimentary rock. There's not enough time in the flood to metamorphose those rocks and then lay down the thick layers.
Well, that's a very correct assumption, but it's only that, an assumption. Basically, the idea that first you have to lay down some sediments or whatever that was, create the metamorphic rock, and then to lay down the sediments on top of them. What about laying down a huge pile of sediments from the very beginning, and then having these hydrothermal solutions that I mentioned before, penetrating through them, and the lower layers turn into what today look like metamorphic rocks. And the rest is sediments. So there's no time gap between the two. All you had initially was a huge pile of sediment, and a part of it has been metamorphosed.
Right.
Actually, geologists also have another concept, retromorphose. So you might have a certain grade of metamorphic rock, say a medium grade, and on top of it, underneath it actually, you have a lower grade of metamorphic rock. Well, that's against the rule, because according to the rule, the deeper you go, the higher the grade of metamorphic rock, or the type of, because the forces are more intense. Yeah. Well, that is an area where some solutions have penetrated and reduced the grade of the metamorphic rock, right? So there's the key to the entire issue. You have solutions penetrating through a huge pile of homogeneous sediments, and it can change into a sedimentary rock, into metamorphic rock, because of the solutions.
See, it's all the assumptions, and that drives this issue so powerfully. It's like, what are your assumptions about what happened back in history?
Right.
You know, if your assumptions are millions of years, you've got to fit everything into millions of years, then you've got these explanations and these apparent contradictions for a global flood, but they can be explained so easily. Right. Lay it all down at once, metamorphose the rocks, only certain layers at the bottom.
Yeah. Not only that, you're dealing with an event, this global flood. I mean, we can't study that event to see what could have happened. It was a very significant, unique event, and we're trying to look at things today and try to translate that into an event that we weren't there to see, and it was very unique.
In addition to that, you run some lab experiments, right? So basically, you interpret a fact by what you can create in the lab, but you can create the similar thing in a lab using a different approach. So you should present all the variants and then choose which fits the bigger model. But no, they're all eliminated except for one.
But nevertheless, I guess the point of all this is that we can explain the observations within a biblical context of a young creation and a global flood.
Right. Now, another objection people have said is, creationists have said, okay, the oils, the fossil fuels, the biomass that got buried at the time of the flood created things like oil and coal and all that. And one objection has been posed that there's too much oil. There's far too much there to have been created with what would have been there at the time of the flood.
In a sudden event, catastrophic, yes. But here's the point. There's another assumption. that that oil comes from dead creatures. Well, what is oil? Hydrocarbon, right? Combination of hydrogen and carbon. Look to the outer planets. They're called gaseous planets, from Jupiter on. Saturn, Neptune, Uranus. They all have, and their moons too, methane gas, methane fluid, and methane solid. Well, those are hydrocarbons, and they do not come from dead creatures.
Right.
So they all agree that that's from the original creation of those planets. The question is, why would only those planets have hydrocarbons? Why wouldn't the Earth also have it, but deep down, like in the Earth's mantle?
Right.
And that's where it comes towards the surface, and it's captured in those sedimentary traps. So that's the so-called abiogenetic origin of oil, that oil is not actually coming from dead creatures, although it could come a part of it. But most of it comes from the original hydrocarbons that were incorporated in the planet as the planet was created.
So then the term fossil fuels may not be accurate.
No, it's just like the living fossils. It's either living or fossil, you know. It's one of those things. But the truth of the matter is there's solid scientific arguments. There are reservoirs that have been pumped out and they were considered finished and then recharged. They refilled with oil. They keep pumping to this day. If that's a sedimentary origin from the time of the sediments formed, there's no way it should refill. So it has to have another source deeper down. You take out the oil and new oil is coming up, refilling it.
Okay, so oil's being produced today, possibly, not the result of buried biomass in the flood, but it's still being produced today. What does that do to the whole ecology movement and that religion of...
Don't want to go there. Well, we all know what that means. It's almost like...
And the price of fuel, right?
We don't want to get into some really, upsetting topics here. We stick to creation evolution.
Well, I mean, it's not. I'm just saying, it's not a lot of people know about that, right?
Yes.
That, and yet, this is secular scientists that talk about this. The potential that oil is still being formed in the mantle today. Very interesting stuff.
Jesus, the Creator. Jesus Christ, who walked the earth 2,000 years ago, is also the creator of the universe. Colossians 1:16 says, "For by him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities, all things were created by him and for him." Also in John 1:3 we read, "All things were made by him, and without him was not anything made that was made." Jesus Christ is the Creator God. Not only does Scripture confirm it, but during his earthly ministry, Jesus did things only the Creator God could do. In an effort to imply that biblical writers were primitive, many people have said that the Bible teaches that the earth is flat, even though the round shape of our planet was an obvious conclusion when watching ships disappear over the horizon and by observing eclipse shadows. What does the Bible say? The implication of a round earth is seen in the New Testament, where Jesus described his return. In Luke 17:31, Jesus said, "In that day." Then in verse 34, "in that night." This is an allusion to light on one side of the globe and darkness on the other simultaneously. In the Old Testament, we read in Isaiah 40:22, "It is he that sitteth upon the circle of the earth." Inspired by their Creator, the earth shape was well known to biblical writers.
Okay, we're talking about different objections that people have posed. Now, we talked about there being too much oil and there being a different way of explaining that. And some people have also used as a similar argument, too much coal. We've got too much coal for that to have happened. How do you explain that? Because that's a different type of substance than the oil would be.
But it also, a tree produces way more volume in terms of what can be turned into coal than any given dead animal, right?
Right.
So there are trees that weigh 200 tons today.
Right.
So these huge trees produce a lot of coal because that's going to turn into a bigger volume of coal. But the important thing is to keep in mind that we're all estimating these things based on the density of the forests and the biomass that we see today.
Right.
Well, that's not exactly the same thing that existed before the flood. If you just simply consider Sahara, for example, and all the deserts, and the high plateaus like Tibet and Gobi, and all the territories that have no forests today, covered with heavy forests.
Right.
there's a tremendous amount of wood in there. Right? And then the wood, during the flood, as the trees are uprooted and they scratch each other, they're going to lose their bark, so the bark is going to sink first to the bottom. And that's one kind of a coal that you can form and you can find. And then further on you find some of the heavier trees and then the lighter trees. So various layers of deposition of wood debris. But what is important also to keep in mind is that with this ascent of hydrocarbons that I mentioned before, they are going also to push a lot of carbon, elementary carbon, from inside the rocks towards the surface. And as this carbon moves upwards, it's going, because what you have, you start down there with a lot of hydrocarbons, and as they move up, they start losing hydrogen until eventually you're only left with carbon, elementary carbon, emerging towards the surface.
Right.
Now, can you imagine when this carbon meets, so it goes through a layer of wooden debris, it's going to turn it into coal, just like that, in an instant, as it filters through it. And then further up, another layer of buried trees, and that was also turned into coal. But the volume of if you consider the pre-flood world as a supercontinent, and the climate globally mild and even, you could have a tremendous amount of biomass, which would basically account for most of this coal.
So again, we're dealing with starting assumptions and unique events, and it's just...
And what you compare with.
Right.
They only have the density of today.
That's right. So again, for Christians to look at somebody's argument just on face value and just go, oh, well, we're going to drop our swords here and say, yeah, it must be right, this couldn't have happened. It bears further investigation, and creationists have some great arguments.
Yeah. I mean, years ago, these were real problems, but I mean, the modern creation revival, if you want to call it that, started in the mid-70s. This is 2009, 2010, and there's been a lot of research done to explain some of these issues, these questions. And so, like, another question is the petrified forest, like you see in Yellowstone, for example. There's multiple layers of petrified trees, and the interpretation is this couldn't be formed, this is millions of years here. How does that work in a flood?
Well, to start with, one significant thing they always fail to mention is that those fossilized trees or petrified trees have no roots. They're just pieces of trunks but not the whole tree.
So they didn't grow there.
They didn't grow there. They've been transported. Now, if you look, and I used to dive, I remember years back, in a lake up in the mountains, and like 10 meters down, in almost the darkness line, I could see these shadows through the water. Huge tree trunks, which get, loaded with water, and they start sinking. And because they're heavy at the base, they tend to stand vertical. And as they would sink to the bottom, they would rest like that on the sediments. Bury them quickly, do another one like that, and bury them quickly, another one. What you have is very different levels of wood buried suddenly during a catastrophe like the flood. And then you have these solutions coming that I mentioned before, the hydrothermal solutions, which carry minerals, and they're going to replace the wood with mineral matter, and they were going to bind together the grains of sand into a sandstone. And what you get? Multiple layers of fossilized forests, but actually not forests.
Running theme here is that these hydrocarbons and hydrothermal processes, well, that's your background, isn't it? Karst landscapes and things happening in caves and how the limestone gets eaten away by acidic or whatever you want to do, that type of solution in the landscape.
And this answer that you just gave us about the different forests is explained perfectly in a DVD you can get from our website called Mount St. Helens, where the exact same thing happened in Spirit Lake. And it's a very interesting DVD.
Does the Bible give clues as to how old the earth is? In Mark 10, verse 6, Jesus said, "But at the beginning of creation, God made them male and female." But if the universe is billions of years old, then Jesus' statement is false because people did not arrive at the beginning but close to the end. The chronogenealogies in Genesis 5 and 11 document that there was 2009 years between the creation of Adam and the birth of Abraham. Since Abraham lived close to 2000 BC, this gives a date for the creation week of around 4000 BC.
The term apologetics comes from the Greek word apologia, meaning defense.
It refers to the type of defense given in a court of law. Christian apologetics is the reasoned defense of the Christian faith against objections. The Apostle Paul said, "We demolish arguments and every pretension that sets itself up against the knowledge of God." 2 Corinthians 10, verse 5. Christians today need to study apologetics as we love the Lord with our mind as well as our heart.
All right, now let's talk about about what's going on in the news.
Right.
Always things going on in the news regarding creation evolution. I've got an article here. It's from the Fox News website on dinosaurs, specifically Triceratops. It's a very interesting article. Goes like this. 3 juvenile Triceratops, a species thought to be solitary, died together in a flood, now have been found in a 66 million year old bone bed in Montana, lending more evidence to the idea that teen dinosaurs were gregarious gangsters. All right, so we open up with this. Okay, we thought they were solitary. Now they admit they were buried in a flood. Of course, not a global flood. They're saying a little flood. But they admit, okay, they were buried in a flood. You probably see that from the sedimentation, rapid burial, that type of thing.
Obviously, to bury 3 of them completely, it must have been a flood-like condition.
Yes, but the focus of the article is that, they were social. Because look, they're buried together.
Right.
So they must have been hanging around together when this little flood buried them all.
Right.
And later in the article it says, the pattern is emerging, the pattern that is emerging is this isn't randomness of fossilization. Okay, so they've seen this a number of times.
Right.
Okay, it's not just random fossils. There's social activity here, and you can tell that because of the way they're buried. Later in the article it says, it looks like at least 3 juveniles died at the same time as a result of flooding, common in this location, laced at the time with floodplains and river channels. We don't know why they were grouped together or how much time they spent together, said Joshua Matthews. Yeah, herding together could have been for protection, and our guess is that this wasn't something they did full time. They're extrapolating. You see what they're doing here, right? They're extrapolating based on, well, they weren't buried in a big flood, and that way moved together. They could have been solitary.
Well, really,
were buried
all
in a big
you
flood.
know about is how they got buried.
Yes.
They might not have even hung around together, but they could have. They all got buried together. You've just found the grave
If you go
site.
further north from there, to Drumheller, you have bone bed 43. Contains 93 skeletons of one species, Centrosaurus, which is a relative of Triceratops.
Yeah.
And they're all buried in a flood.
Right.
And they said actually they were initially buried in a flood and then moved and redeposited by another flood in another way.
Oh, okay.
Another place. So are we to believe that all Triceratopses were suddenly, had felt this urge to cross a river in the middle of a flood and be buried there worldwide? Because that's where you find them.
Yeah.
Most of
The focus of this article, they're extrapolating based on finding these 3 juveniles buried together, that they hung around in gangs, the word they use here.
We have evidence that some dinosaurs had nurseries. Like 2 dozen cuddled like that by an adult. They're all buried and killed like that, but that was a Maiasaurus.
Right.
So,
yeah. But these conclusions are based on the idea that there wasn't a global flood. If there was a global flood, those conclusions don't apply.
Right. And what I like to do, to get young people to do, is take an article like that and basically, I say, underline the facts versus the interpretations.
Yes.
And what you find is if you use 2 different colors to do that, let's say you use yellow for facts and red for interpretations, you basically, it looks like a, St. Valentine's Day massacre. There's all these assumptions going into it. And again, what we're pointing out is the paradigm that you start with, but I mean, every time I've ever seen an article on dinosaurs, it's always been interpreted through millions of years, et cetera, et cetera.
I find it funny, and we still haven't decided if T-Rex was a carnivore or a scavenger.
Yeah.
But we're certain about these guys behaving as a group.
Yeah.
Fascinates me.
Here was one that you mentioned to me. It's called Deep Sea Rocks Point to an Early Oxygen on Earth. Now, I'm just going to read the article and then we can discuss what this means for the creation evolution debate. Red jasper cord from layers 3.46 billion years old suggests that not only did the oceans contain abundant oxygen then, but that the atmosphere was as oxygen rich as it is today, according to geologists. And it says many people have assumed that the hematite in ancient rocks formed by the oxidation of siderite in the modern atmosphere says one of the professors here from Penn State. That is why we wanted to drill deeper below the water table and recover unweathered rocks. So now they're saying that there was the amount of oxygen back then, early Earth, that there is today. What difference does that make in the creation evolution debate?
Well, the only hope evolutionists have to explain life emerging from non-life by random combinations is that the initial atmosphere of the Earth had no free oxygen.
And why would that be?
Because if it is there,
I know, but I want people to know.
If it is there, it's going to destroy every combination, chemical combination that could be a precursor to life.
Oxygen is a very reactive gas.
Exactly.
It reacts with many things.
So it'll have to have a reductive environment, no oxygen. Well, it turns out that when the first kind, according to the evolutionists, the first elements of life have actually emerged, they already had oxygen, which doesn't work.
Right.
So that ruins, because one of the things in Stanley Miller's experimental device was the lack of oxygen.
Yeah.
If you put free oxygen in there, forget it. You're not going to have anything which
and many viewers will probably remember that in textbooks, this Stanley Miller experiment.
Yeah, very famous.
Very famous, and I still hear people discuss it today, Q&A time, and you'll see it in arguments for supposedly we know how life evolved, et cetera. And that was a key ingredient.
With oxygen there in the beginning, there's no way you can even imagine a way that life emerged from non-life.
Yeah.
Forget it. It's not there.
And it's amazing that, I mean, the more we know about life and about how life works at the very small level, and there's oxygen, you got oxygen in the environment, so that there's more and more evidence, and I mean it's scientific stuff, observational evidence. All right, we've got these rocks, and they're full of oxygen, right, or the results of oxidization, and evolutionists say that they date them incorrectly, but there's more and more evidence against evolution, and so a lot of times in the news section, you've got this information and it's interpreted via evolution, and if they mention creation, it's just creation is religious, it doesn't count, we can't go there, we can't do anything, and it just seems like they're trying to put it in a little box and get it off to the side, because if you give it an equal footing or something like that, it'll just blow evolution out of the water.
Well, it's interesting to think, too, that, I mean, obviously people are going to criticize our interpretation. So if we point something out like this, what are you going to do? You're going to change your starting assumption. Well, maybe life didn't have to be that way.
You need to keep in mind that the vast majority of people get their information from the media.
Yep.
And the media doesn't understand much of the scientific stuff. So what happens is, for example, they fail to mention that if you further shorten the time available for evolution, like the discovery of vertebrates in the Precambrian, then you don't have a solution to your problem, you have an extra problem, because now the time you have for animals to evolve is even shorter.
But
the media is never going to tell you that, oh, that's the holy grail of evolution. What do you mean the holy grail? It's a holy sepulcher, maybe.
But you can always change your starting assumptions when you're talking about something in the past. Right? I could criticize that. We've shown that and say, okay, well, this criticizes the evolutionary paradigm, but they can do the same thing to us. Christians need to understand that. There's all these presuppositions that are going into it, and that we can defend the Bible scientifically.
That's right.
In Genesis chapter 2, the order of creation seems to be different to that in chapter 1, with the plants being created after Adam. Does the Bible contradict itself here? A close look at the original language reveals that the plants mentioned in chapter 2, verse 5 refers to cultivated plants only, not all plants. The point being made is that in the world before the curse, before the appearance of thorns and thistles, no one was needed to cultivate plants. Another thing to keep in mind is that Genesis 2 is not a chronological account like chapter 1. It focuses mostly on the details of day 6. When the Bible appears to contradict itself, careful study always reveals that the Bible is free of contradiction. It really is the Word of God.
When Dr. Carl Whelan started Creation magazine in his home in 1978, little did he realize that today it would reach into some 170 countries all around the world and have such a huge impact in so many lives. This unique 56-page full-color family magazine refutes evolution and gives God the glory for the amazing creation we see around us. Creation Magazine is an essential tool for anyone wanting to immunize their family against the anti-biblical worldviews bombarding us from all sides. With no paid advertising, every page in Creation Magazine is chock full of powerful articles, ammunition to intelligently discuss nature, history, science, the Bible, and related subjects. Although written for lay people, every effort is made to ensure the content is technically accurate so that even experts are satisfied. And young children look forward to the section written especially for them. Many have come to faith in Christ because of subscribers sharing this magazine with them. So subscribing not only boosts your faith, it enables you to get biblical truth into your community in a special way. Subscribe today and have it delivered to your home every 3 months. Visit creation.com for subscription information or call the CMI office nearest you.
Another question, another objection to a global flood is that there's these superimposed horizons of different footprints. You've got a layer of footprints in sediment, then you've got more sediment footprints on those, more sediment footprints on those. There's not enough time in the flood to produce all those different sediments and have animals walking around and making those footprints. So how do we respond to that?
That is a very good question, and shows that people who ever listen to us are actually very attentive. They really pay attention to what we say, and that's good. Well, you see, it all boils down to how you depict, visualize the flood. One sudden dump of stuff, or actually a gradual process. With a sudden dump in the beginning, huge amounts of sediments washed and moved. Then, as the entire earth is covered by water, you will have the flood, the tides and ebbs, moving up and down, and every now and then you will have land emerging, like soft sediments. Now, one of the results of the flood would be a tremendous amount of floating debris, mostly wood.
Right.
Like huge islands. You can see that in the deltas today. Floating islands, starting with a tree, and then it's just floating, and then there's more debris, getting tangled in the branches, and you have a floating island. Now try to imagine animals during the flood taking a ride, on such floating mats, and then you see a little bit of a land where this mat is stopping, so they will go on land. But lo and behold, what happens? The water is coming back, so they run back maybe to their floating mats,
or get drowned,
or get drowned.
Yep.
Okay,
Sometimes.
so there's ways to explain that, and of course then eventually they all do die.
Yes.
All life outside the ark that breathed air and died.
But that's how you get various layers, and then the whole thing it's underwater, it's covered by new sediments, and it emerges again. Some other animals will come, maybe the same ones, who knows? But these are not as frequent. People need to understand that 95% of all existing fossils that we know of are actually marine invertebrates. Mm-hmm. The dinosaurs are tiny little fragment of it.
Yes, yeah. So okay, we have a story that seems to explain this. So I guess the conclusion, we weren't there, we don't know exactly what happened. Mm-hmm. This seems like a plausible answer.
Right.
But the ultimate conclusion is this should not stop anyone from accepting a global flood.
Yes.
Right, because one of the things I thought of when I heard of this argument is, okay, how quickly does the rock take, how fast can it actually solidify? Because you'd need the creatures coming across and then those footprints to actually become footprints, and then you get your next layer of sediment. And we know now that rock can form very quickly, depending on the solutions that are in it.
Yeah, like concrete.
Right. It forms even underwater. I mean, I have encountered situations, and the situation I know, that actually underwater, at the bottom of a river, you have the gravel cemented together. If the water is rich enough in minerals, even as it flows, it will bind them together. All you have to do is to have a solid enough layer underneath, like a coarser one, and then you'll have this footprint.
So you could even have animals treading water, but as long as their feet touch the sediments, they could form footprints, which would go hard, and then you get another shot of sediment. So, okay, well, let's ask this question. This is right up your alley. People say, well, how could you get caves form during the flood? And this is your area of specialty. So
the only caves we can investigate today are caves that have formed recently.
Right.
If caves have formed in the past, in the geologic past, they're not there because we don't see them. There are some entities they call paleokarst, like ancient karst, but those are not displaying the general features of a cave. They're just voids inside the rock. Now you can have voids created miles down by solutions that I mentioned before. They eat the rock away and they create these voids, and then the voids are invaded by sediments or something else, and that's what you find there. Well, that's the so-called paleocars. But the only caves that actually can be investigated as caves today are caves that have formed even after the Ice Age, so in very recent times. And they are actually forming in hard rocks. But even there, when you have mazes like 350 miles, passages put together, and huge rooms, like volumes, incredible volumes, they cannot be just excavated by the dripping water today. They have also been excavated by hydrothermal solutions. Actually, the big room in Carlsbad Caverns has been calculated today because that cave has formed by sulfuric acid coming from nearby oil deposits. And that huge chamber is one of the biggest in the world, has formed by the solutions produced in a year.
Yeah.
So
I was there a number of years ago, actually, just to give you an idea of the size. The perimeter around this one room, called the big room that you mentioned, is 9.5 miles. This is underground, deep underground, the perimeter around this room. So, huge.
Yes. And in this case, it's sulfuric acid which is produced deep down that ate away the limestones.
Which came first, the chicken or the egg? Most evolutionists believe that two non-chickens mated, and the DNA in their new zygote contained the mutations that produced the first true chicken. Unfortunately for evolutionists, the science of genetics does not support their claim. Geneticist Dr. Lee Spetner wrote, "Not even one mutation has been observed that adds even a little information to the genome." According to the Bible, chickens came first. God created a functionally complete universe. Adam and Eve were created as mature humans, complete with the ability to communicate with God and each other.
Okay, continuing with objections to Noah's flood. Here's one I get all the time. Question and answer time. Why don't we find human and dinosaur skeletons together?
Right.
If the creationists are saying that the fossil layers, the majority of them got buried at the time of the flood, how come we haven't found that?
Well, I could answer with another question.
Okay.
Why don't we find human and, say, coelacanth fossils together? Because they know they lived at the same time.
Right.
Why can't we find whale skeletons and coelacanth
And
skeletons
the
together?
coelacanth is a type
It's a
of
fish.
fish that was once thought to be millions of years old, and then they found live ones off the coast of Madagascar.
It was actually going to be a transitional form. See, it's got bones and its fins, and it evolved into something else. Of course, there's humans and coelacanths living today and scuba diving together.
Why don't we find them together in the flood? Well, there's a number of other reasons why not. First of all, humans and dinosaurs did not live the same areas. I don't think they shared the same biotope, so to speak, in the pre-flood environment. It just doesn't make sense. They need kind of big accommodations for the dinosaurs. But in addition to that, humans, most of the humans that died during the flood died by drowning. Now, if you drown, you're not going to fossilize. You're going to bloat and float, and eventually you decompose.
Now, you're assuming that most people drown because they would be more agile, more able to get it.
They understood what was going on, so they had time to run away from the areas that was to be flooded. Some of them might have used boats and all that. So it's just logical to assume that most humans have tried to escape much better than the animals did,
right?
The heavier ones. And then, of course, if they drown, there's no chance for them to be fossilized. That's I believe quite an obvious conclusion. We don't know any skeleton actually that remained at any shipwreck, which is shipwreck site that's older than several hundred years, because the bones themselves will be dissolved by the seawater.
Right.
In addition to that, you can only produce a fossil if you bury it suddenly in very thick sediments. And most of the dinosaurs didn't die that way either. They were actually also they drowned, and therefore they disappeared. Nothing remained after them. But the ones that were buried, it's very clear that that's one of the reasons. And there's an interesting case here in North America. The largest of all dinosaurs are the sauropods, the big plant eaters.
Sure.
And there's no sauropod trace, either as fossil or footprints, north of the US-Canadian border. And I thought it had some visual issues in there. It looks to me that the fact that you have T-Rexes and hadrosaurs up north in Alaska, but no sauropods, is that the T-Rexes and the Hadrosaurs, which was smaller, much more agile, they could escape further north. But the big guys were caught by the waters running in from the south. But let's just assume that one day you will show an evolutionist a dinosaur skeleton mixed with a human skeleton. You think they will agree that the Bible is true and that dinosaurs and humans live together? No. They're going to say, well, that's evidence that in the future humans will evolve so much as to build time machines and travel back into time and visit dinosaurs at home.
So one of those was fossilized, and that's why we see it today. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Better than that, admitting that the scripture is true.
There's lots of evidence that humans lived with dinosaurs. I think hopefully one day we will find human fossils with dinosaur fossils. And that'll just be another evidence to answer that question.
And of course, we went into this in depth in the episode we did on dinosaurs, and we showed how you don't just find dinosaurs in one place. There's all sorts of creatures mixed together and stuff, and we haven't found a human and a dinosaur yet, but we may.
So one final question. There's no way that Noah could have built a 450-foot-long wooden barge that would have floated properly and survived the flood. And we've of course done a program on this already. We've given examples.
Well, that's what I was told by a naval engineer. Since that's not my specialty, I had to agree with him. And guess who saved me? National Geographic. They published a beautiful article about the famous Chinese expedition between 1400 and 1403 to Mozambique. And Admiral Jiang He had 150,000 people with him, and amongst the many boats they had 40 Bao-chuans, also known as Ming treasure ships. And guess what? A Bao-chuan is about almost exactly the size of the Ark. The mere fact that today naval engineers cannot build wooden vessels that size, keelless bottom, flat bottom, doesn't mean they couldn't do it in the past. When, by the way, humans were building huge boats like that on land, and they were asking for a flood to launch them. That was a very special event, and therefore it had a specially designed boat for it. But it is feasible. Technically, we can build it, and the Chinese have shown that.
Wonderful.
That's great. Skeptics versus creationists. Ever wonder what would happen when leading creationists and skeptics clash head to head, both sides putting forward their best arguments and evidences? In June 2005, Creation Ministries International, Australia, accepted an invitation for a written mini-debate with the Australian skeptics on the Sydney Morning Herald weblog of Margot Kingston, a well-known left-wing Australian journalist. The topic was, did the universe and life evolve, or was it specially created in 6 days? A major newspaper, the Sydney Morning Herald, hosted this formal web debate with rebuttals and counter-rebuttals featuring scientists from both Creation Ministries International and the Australian Skeptics Society. You be the judge. Great for witnessing. Okay, here we are in the feedback section of Creation Magazine Live. I like this section. And we often get feedbacks from people, and it's interesting to hear, people's comments. This feedback in particular struck me as very interesting because it's from a gentleman who is an intelligent design advocate, does not believe in evolution, subscribes to Creation Magazine, but is not a Christian. And so what he actually says is, he says, I've been a supporter of creation since the early 90s, and thanks to your very good scientific reasoning, I'm still convinced of intelligence, design, and nature. And then he goes on to question the validity of basically Christ's ministry on earth and things like that. Okay. So here's a guy who's just looking at the science saying, it seems to support some kind of creation or intelligent design model. But his argument was that he'd been reading a book called The 16 Messiahs. And in this book, written by a skeptic, it basically points to supposedly Christ's basically before Jesus. Other messiahs that had come and gone, and they had 12 disciples, and they were born on December 25th, and seemingly like the Christian faith had been basically adopted from these ancient myths. Okay. And so he wanted us to give a reasoned, detailed critique of this model, because he's come to recognize that our staff give reasoned and detailed critiques of the things that come along.
I try to.
And we try as much as we can, and even though we're a creation evolution, that's what we usually talk about. We'll talk about any kind of apologetic, Christian apologetic. Now, here's some of the things that Dr. Jonathan Sarfati answered him back with. Here's some problems with those copycat messiahs. Is that these alleged crucified saviors were neither crucified nor resurrected in the original legends. If you actually look into the source material that this fellow was depending on, those like Osiris were not at all a parallel to a resurrection on this earth. He was not resurrected at all, but became Lord of the underworld, where Jesus appeared on earth to 500 people at once and ate fish. Also, the death, rebirth, death cycles in paganism have nothing to do with the once and for all resurrection of Jesus. See, it's interesting because what the skeptic has done is says, oh, well, it's a resurrection just like Jesus. But when you actually look at the source material, it has nothing to do with what we know as Christians know. But, you know, they try to slur it and make it sound similar, but it's not similar at all. And then the alleged virgin birth parallels were really stories of gods impregnating women who were thus not virgins by definition. Mary, on the other hand, was overshadowed by the Holy Spirit, had no sexual intercourse after Jesus was born. And John actually referred to a couple of other articles there. This particular article struck me because I had a personal experience just a couple weeks ago where I had a friend phone me up. And he said, you know, I'm having a real crisis of faith. And now this is a fellow that I've known for a little while. And he was actually a professional boxer. He's probably one of the toughest men I've ever met. And yet what had happened is he was watching a TV show, and this skeptic had referred to these arguments. And he said, you know, Cal, it just blew my faith away. I couldn't believe it that there was these other Christs and Messiahs and stuff like that. So I actually referred him to this article, and we talked for a while, and he realized, oh yeah, okay, well there's different ways of looking at the evidence and stuff. It just amazed me that, you know, that someone could just be shaken. You know, you go from standing firm, and then all of a sudden the skeptics come up with something, and he just didn't realize there was even places to turn to get answers. So it's important.
People do not understand, and most people can't know this kind of thing, but most of these ancient languages, in their written versions, didn't have signs for vowels. So you have to fill in the vowels. And you can have the same consonants and different vowels meaning different things. So in the best of cases, what we have in these legends of the past are best approximations of the original text.
Right.
So you cannot know. And just by merely somebody writing a book that looks like these things and those things are the same doesn't mean they're actually the same.
Right.
It's someone's interpretation of things,
Yep.
of facts.
Exactly.
Yeah. Ultimately, it's another attack on the authority of Scripture, specifically the character of Christ.
Right. Right.
There's another one here. This one's titled "Answering Uninformed Atheists on DNA Complexity," and this is just an example of, you know, you're on Facebook. I think they even mentioned it here. Yeah, I'll just read this. Recently, I was on Facebook and partaking in a conversation about the creation of new information in the genome. Right. So we're talking about life.
Common creationist argument
at the basic level. Yes. This is what one fellow said, and I was hoping that you might be able to help me see where he went wrong. And then this fellow starts in about DNA and so on. One of the things he says is, on the question of first cause, it does not need a base. The base for DNA is protein, and the protein the base for protein is amino acids, and the base for amino acids is nitrogen. I'm not a biochemist, but the formation of amino acids by lightning or similar from natural materials has been shown, this person says, as has the formation of proteins from amino acids. Sure, nobody's shown the formation of DNA from proteins in the lab, but that's a matter of chance.
So this sounds very authoritative, and the person knows what he's talking about. And
yes, yeah, and then it just goes on. He talks about information, that kind of thing, and the response is there's a lot of hand waving by this respondent, and ultimately Jonathan Sarfati, who's the responder here,
who's a biochemist,
says this critic is clueless about biochemistry when he says the base for DNA is protein. DNA is made from nucleotides, not amino acids, and so it's another example of, get a little bit of information and we can answer some of these skeptics' arguments, and that's what Creation Ministries is all about.